and preview.
Are you ready? Cool. Okay, well, thank you guys all for coming. It's so great to see so many new and old faces. I'm Renee. I'm one of the workers here, along with Stephanie and Danielle. So if you have questions about the house or you're interested in learning more, you can talk to one of the three of us. And so we're doing this Catholic Worker School to honor one of the principles of the Catholic worker movement, which is clarity of thought, kind of helping people know who we are, what we're about. It's always good for ourselves to keep studying and learning about the roots of the movement. And we thought it'd be a great way to welcome in new folks who maybe wanted to learn more about the house. What better way than something that's all about learning? So we're starting with our founders, Peter Maurin, Dorothy Day, and then kind of going through the basics of the program, which are cult, culture, and cultivation, also known as the houses of hospitality, newspapers or newsletters, and farming movements, right? So kind of this comprehensive way of living a life that reflects the gospel. It's kind of the goal of the movement. But I'm mostly just saying hi, telling you who the workers are, and then introducing you to James, who I may be biased, but is, and he's too humble to tell you himself, but is an expert on Peter Maurin. So James grew up in Rochester. His dad was a French teacher, and so he grew up going to France, which is where Peter Maurin is from, and learned French. And there was a video of James interviewing Peter Maurin's great-grandnephew that almost made it to the slideshow and got cut at the last minute. So you could have heard James's French in action. And James, after various various pilgrimages through the professional world, ended up at the Rochester Catholic Worker in 2014, and was there for 5 years before going to the St. Joseph's House in New York City, which was one of the last houses that Dorothy Day lived in before she died, which is where we met. And right when you were kind of wrapping up your time in Rochester, like 2016 and then 2017 as well, right?
Yeah.
James was visiting his sister who lived in France and took a detour down to the south of France to Mende, which is where Peter Maurin is from. And you started learning more about Peter Maurin. And then James's pandemic hobby, mine was baking sourdough bread, his was digging into the archives of Peter Maurin at Marquette and different sort of archives you and a coworker found across the country. So I thought he would be a great person to kick us off with sort of the person who started the whole movement, Peter Maurin. And yeah, so that's why James is leading us in our first Catholic Worker School. And like I said, we're recording it, no one's face will be in it except James, who has already consented. Your voice will be in it. If you're uncomfortable with that, like, you can talk to me afterwards and we can cut out your question or whatever you feel. But yeah, over to you.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks to everyone being here. Thanks for the introduction, Renee. And to St. Francis House for putting this on. This is great. And so, yeah, like most people who end up at the Catholic Worker House who are interested in the movement, they usually come in after being exposed or having read Dorothy Day, and I was no different. When I moved into the Rochester which is also called St. Joseph's House of Hospitality in Rochester, New York, I had read The Long Loneliness, and I had read, different on pilgrimage article, her column, Dorothy Day's column, was very much inspired by her activism, by, I think, all the same reasons that people come in, but Peter Maurin was not really on my radar. I had read about him, and I was so focused on Dorothy Day that Peter Maurin kind of slipped through the net for me. But when I moved into St. Joseph's House of Hospitality, within a couple of years, it's an interesting house, St. Joe's in Rochester, because it's the oldest house of hospitality in the universe, okay? Now, it's not the oldest community, but it's the oldest surviving house. It opened in 1941, and it's the only house left in the movement where both Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin had visited. So there was kind of some pride in that, and there was this guy by the name of Dr. Harry Murray, not Murphy, Dr. Harry Murray, who really began to indoctrinate me into Peter Maurin, and really showed me, a deeper level of the Catholic work, and I really came to understand and believe that in order to understand Dorothy Day, in order to understand the Catholic worker movement, you cannot ignore Peter Maurin. The whole idea of the movement, clarity, the whole program, clarity of thought, houses of hospitality, Catholic worker farms, that's all Peter Maurin. And the culture, cultivation, another Peter Maurin expression. And so I really took a deep interest, and because of my French background, that also helped. And so there was that part of it too. But another thing that really drew me to Peter Maurin was he wrote a lot about the Irish, and not a lot, but he wrote about the Irish, and much of the program is based on these 6th and 7th century Irish monks who left Ireland starting in the 6th century and kind of went out to Europe after the Dark Ages, and really laid the foundations of medieval Europe. And Peter Maurin kind of looked to the Irish, and his idea was like, look, what the Irish did 1,000 years ago, we could do today. And that was kind of the vision of the Catholic worker movement as well, that houses of hospitality would be agronomic universities, would be places of learning, in addition to the works of mercy and beyond Catholic worker farms. So it all kind of comes together. And so really the goal, what I'd like to get across today, is one, just to introduce people to his life, to some of his thought and the program of the Catholic worker and his influence on Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker in general. I think another goal is to show that he's someone to be taken seriously. I think in the Catholic worker, oftentimes, not always, and I think it might be changing, he's kind of seen as like this court jester, his easy essays are funny. He was this, very short guy. He had a very thick French accent. And just in a lot of ways, he's just kind of left in the shadow of Dorothy Day. And I think it's really important to kind of smash that image. And if we're really going to get a good foundation as Catholic workers, or to understand the Catholic worker movement and to understand Dorothy Day, it's really important to have that foundation. And I think, let's see here. Okay, so the Catholic Worker newspaper was the medium that he had in mind when he approached Dorothy Day in 1932. So some of this program was already in place. Some of these ideas were already in place long before he met Dorothy Day. And if you recall, they met in December of 1932, and the newspaper comes out in May of 1933. So, and the following, in the next edition, the June edition of 1933, is Peter's program. So I've always had this idea that he had been working on this for quite some time, and so before he met Dorothy Day, this program had kind of been percolating in him for quite some time. So I think some of the things I want to just kind of keep in the background during this discussion today is, his famous 3 C's: cult, culture, cultivation, which I think informed the clarity of thought, the houses of hospitality, and the Catholic worker farms. These were always in the background. And these would form the program. Voluntary poverty was and is the underpinning of the Catholic worker movement. And And he also proposed that the evangelical councils, so the poverty, chastity, and obedience, were not only for religious, that's to say priests, nuns, monks, and whatnot. It was for all. It was for all Catholics, all Christians, and so this was always. These are some underlying threads. So first, we're going to delve into his life in France, and then his immigration to North America, and then the beginnings of his life in upstate New York, and then finally we'll try to end it around 1932 where he meets Dorothy Day. So we're not going to get too much into all of his intellectual sources and readings and things like that. I think that'll come later as we progress through this. Now there's two, I gave out a few handouts. The first one and the primary source for this whole, for this Catholic Worker School is the Catholic Worker Movement, The Intellectual and Spiritual Origins by Mark and Louise Zwick. They're the founders of the Houston Catholic Worker. This book came out in like the mid-2000s, I think. It's a great book. Highly recommend it if you're interested in learning more about the Catholic Worker. So I've printed out a few pages. Does everyone have a copy? Let's see here. Why don't you use the book? It starts on page 14. Okay, so Peter Maurin, he's born in 1877 in Mende, France. Well, really in this town called Urte, which is in the south of France. How do I pull this up? There we go. You got a map of France here. So Mende is right down here. Okay, it's in the Lozère region, and the town of Urte is a very, very small hamlet outside of Mende, probably about 14 miles outside of Mende. And so that's where he's born. He's the eldest of 24 children. His birth mother died after giving birth to, his birth mother he's the eldest. His mother dies after the 5th child. His father remarries about 2 years after his mother's death, and they have 19 children. So really big family. And 3 of his sisters became nuns, and 3 of his brothers became Christian brothers. Very Catholic area, very Catholic family. And the Lozère region, right here in the south of France, was, originally, to go back far into that history to understand the region, because the Maurin family claims that they had been on that land for 1,500 years. Okay, so this is a space that they've occupied for untold generations. I don't know how many generations is 1,500 years, but it's probably a lot in that. So it was originally a Roman outpost, and Lozère is named after, it's called Mount Lozère, and Urte is at the top of Mount Lozère. So you can see why a Roman outpost, military outpost, they'd have a pretty good view of what was going on in the area. So Catholicism is present very early. There's different accounts, but there's this, the first bishop of Mende is called Saint Privatus, who is known today as Saint Privat, so Privat. And there's different accounts. Some say he was from the 2nd century up through the 4th century. He was martyred when he refused to give up the location of, they just called them barbarians. I don't know exactly who was coming down. But he refused to give up the hiding place. He was tortured and murdered. So there's also a pope from the region, Pope Blessed Urban V, who is the last of the Avignon popes. He was elected in 1262. It might be 13, I think it's 1262. He's the only one of the Avignon popes to be blessed, so he's the only one that's been beatified. He was a monk, a Benedictine monk, and he was not a cardinal when he was elected. He was outside, so that, I don't know a great history of the Avignon popes at that time period, but there was obviously a lot of friction, and so they could not agree on someone from the cause of cardinals, and so they elected this guy who was a pretty famous abbot and at the time, and also a teacher of canon law. He was a reformer pope. He opened up universities in Poland and Hungary, and he also opened up medical colleges and hospices and things of that nature. So and there's also 5 or 6 other saints from this very small region of Lozère. And it's also a place where there was a lot of religious strife. After the Reformation and the religious wars, this region plays a very large role, and also the French Revolution, very anti-clerical elements within that. When I went to the town and I was given a tour, they actually pointed out the last fleur-de-lis every fleur-de-lis was destroyed. You used to probably see them everywhere in France, but they just defaced all the fleur-de-lis, which was a very, very Catholic symbol. Also royal symbol as well. I think another interesting thing about the region is they had their own language. So Peter Maurin's born in 1877. He says that his parents spoke mostly, today they call it a patois, but the region is also known as Pays d'Oc, D''OC, which was going way back in the early history of France. There was kind of a competition as to which language would become the language of France. So you had Pays d'Oc, which was how you said yes in the Lozère region and Provence and all of that. And then up in the north, closer to Paris and all of that, you had, it was Doi, which is H-O-C, uc, for in Latin is uc oi, is that's it. That's how you say, and that becomes oui in French. Duck didn't make it. They didn't have the power to take over the rest of France, and it was the kings who kind of did it. But the French Revolution was kind of the people still spoke the language in the region, and the French Revolution was kind of the final nail in the coffin of the language, although in 1877, many of the inhabitants spoke it. So Peter Maurin really didn't begin to learn French until he was 14 years old and started going to French school. He probably know both languages, but probably the dominant tongue growing up was probably closer to Catalan than French. So he's born in 1877, and he lives on the land. They're a peasant family. They're, they have obviously a large. There's a lot of Maurins lying around, and just to kind of give you another history, a little piece of history, the last name Maurin, the Latin root of that, M-A-U-R-E, is Moor, as in the Moors who had occupied Spain, and also parts had come into the southern area of his region. So Maurin is the second most popular family name in the region today. So it kind of just shows another twist of the depth of time that his family endured, to the point where even his last name may have been influenced by an occupying force that came down. No one knows, why, how that became to be, but the root is certainly, without a doubt, indicates more, or the Moors. So really, his childhood is on the land. He's born in May 9th, 1877. He's baptized the next day. His real name is Aristide Pierre Joseph Maurin. So he's Aristide Peter Joseph Maurin is his full baptismal name, his full given name. And they have a vegetable garden. The family, they own cows and sheep. The economy is a little bit more medieval in the sense that they still have a lot of land in common, and they share. They have like one shepherd who would take. They would pay a shepherd to take 3 or 4 family sheep and graze them on different fields, and there was a lot of bartering. They would barter sheep or meat for fish. They didn't grow any hops, and the grapes weren't great in that region, so they were not wine drinkers or beer drinkers. There was a lot of goat milk and cow milk, and he has really great recollections of his childhood. So in a sense, you can kind of begin to see the beginnings of the Catholic worker movement, that it's really modeled on his own life as a peasant in Mende, or in that region in Lozère. They also have a communal bread oven, and he described how the townsfolk would come to this bread oven in Ulte. So it's about 15-20 families living in this small village. Their houses are very tightly bunched together, and the land is, they all have their own vegetable gardens and whatnot. But the bread oven, they would come and bake bread. They broke bread together as well. But and it was around there that they would share news, that they would have discussions, that they would have. So in a sense, it was like the round table. That's how he viewed it. And so that's it. He has chores. He has to cut firewood. They have very specific ways of doing it. They're very much in tune with the land. They would cut branches of trees for firewood, and they were very particular about which branches they would cut, so that they would have, so they wouldn't go through it all. They've been on the land for 1,500 years, so obviously they know how to use the resources that are around them. So that's kind of Peter the worker, right? So from 0 to 14, he's free labor for his parents. At age 14, he becomes Peter the Scholar. This is the beginning of Peter the Scholar. And if you know anything about the Catholic worker movement, there's one thing that Peter Moore always talks about. He's like, I want workers to become scholars and scholars to become workers. So I'm trying to draw that part of the movement into it. So at age 14, he goes to it's called a collège. It would be like a middle school, high school, and it's called Saint-Privat, named after the 2nd century bishop, and it's run by the Christian Brothers, whose founders Jean-Baptiste de la Salle. Okay, and they had opened up schools all over France. Very difficult to do so in the 1880s and 90s and early 1900s, because there was, for the first time, education had become compulsory, and there was kind of this fight between secular and religious schools. And there was a big fight. Mons won, the citizens got what they wanted, which was a private Catholic French school, and he goes off there. And I think this is a good place to kind of jump into our primary document. Because it's on page 18. I've got I've got a little star there, but going down a little bit, I underlined one, but going back a little bit, the work of the Christian Brothers in France was especially to teach poor children. The founder was an educational innovator, that's Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, and Peter learned about educational methods from the brothers. It was from these methods that Peter developed his teaching and writing style, using simple language and clear definitions to express important principles. He also learned from the brothers that the personal example of the teacher living the gospel was key to the teaching method. So I haven't really introduced this part of Peter Maurin yet, but we all know, well, I'm sure many of us have heard of Peter Maurin's easy essays, which is really what he's kind of most famous for today. But this is, yeah, these are the roots of it. Because what happens is after 3 or 4 years with the Christian Brothers, he decides to go on and become a Christian brother himself. And so in 1891, he leaves Mende and he goes to Paris. And he begins the process of becoming a teacher with the Christian Brothers. So not only does he learn this as a student, he's now being kind of formed as a teacher. And really, a teacher is what he becomes the rest of his life. Even though he doesn't stay long with the Christian Brothers, he ends up at one point in 1899, he has to do his compulsory military service. And so they took a break from his novitiate. He went and did his service. He came back. But again, I think there's one thing about Peter Maurin. One of the titles of the book is of his biography is Peter Maurin, Prophet in the 20th Century, and I think he is very prophetic. Not only when he speaks about all of the things that he speaks about in his easy essays in terms of history and economics and things like that. He has very much prophetic vision, but also in his own life. He saw what was going on with the educational system in France, and he knew, and probably many other people did at the time, he knew that Christian Brothers schools were not going to be around long. And so in 1902, he does not take his final vows with the Christian Brothers. And he had started around simultaneously working with this organization, this thing called Le Sillon. I think it's the badger in English. And Le Sillon plays a major role, I think, in his formation. And so he leaves knowing that school is going to be shut down, and he's right, the schools are shut down. And he starts working with Le Sillon, so now on page 20, at the top of this, on the first paragraph, it was started by, Le Sillon, started and led by Marc Seigneur. It was dedicated to the formation of responsible Christians who would unite workers and students in a democracy. Okay, so we're around 1902 now. The encyclical Rerum Novarum has been out for almost 10 years, and people are really excited about it. There's all sorts of things going on, and I think Le Sillon is another expression of this exuberance. And in a lot of ways, Le Sillon, the way it operates, there's a lot of similarities between what the Catholic worker would go on to operate themselves. And just going down a little bit here, I underlined some things, but I want to just go up a couple of sentences. So he leaves the Christian Brothers. Peter rented a room in a poor section of Paris. He sold the newspaper of the movement, L'éveil démocratique, the democratic awakening, at meetings on the streets and in front of churches, as the Catholic worker was later sold in the streets. Sheehan wrote of the elements of Le Sillon that were similar to the Catholic worker, where a long-term commitment was not required in order to participate in the movement, quote, there was no enrollment, no dues, no rules, no elections. One entered freely and left freely. No one received a salary, but there were indemnities for personal needs. The ablest rose to leadership not by being elected, but by the sheer force in their knowledge and personality. I don't know if that's always true in the Catholic worker, but certainly a lot of that sounds familiar to anyone who's spent time around the Catholic worker movement.
James,
Could you maybe explain what Rerum Novarum is for people who don't know?
Okay, so Rerum Novarum is, what's the English again, on labor?
Of new things.
Of new
Well,
things?
that's the translation.
Of new things. So Rerum Novarum was an encyclical. Does anyone know what, are we all? So an encyclical is a letter basically to the world on different subjects. It can be theological, it can be all sorts of different things. This particular one really kind of surprised the world. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. There's all sorts of abuses and people working long hours. There's a lot of friction between unions. Whether or not it's okay to form a union, and so Pope Leo XIII, who is a prolific writer of encyclicals. I don't think any pope has written more encyclicals than Pope Leo XIII. He comes out with this encyclical and kind of giving the okay, like yes, organizing unions is for the common good. That we have a responsibility for fair wages. He also talks about private property and promoting private property, but in the sense that everyone should get a little piece of private property. And Peter Maurin would always say, the difference between Catholics believe in private property, but we need to believe in private property with responsibility. And that responsibility, I think he's kind of hearkening to the common lands, or being able, allowing people in need to use your land, but not just a few people owning all the private property. Does that help a little bit? Okay. So he leaves Le Sillon in 1902 or 19. Okay, so sorry, I'm jumping ahead. He's with them for about 5 years, okay? And around 1908, he becomes to be a little skeptical of them. He thinks they're getting too political. There's a quote in here, Sheehan implies, quote, their scholarship was not good enough, but he leaves the movement, essentially is what happened. Now, another thing is going on simultaneously in that, here in this, they say Peter consulted with his family and then moved to Canada to homestead with a wave of French immigrants. But really what was going on was Peter Maurin, who had done his military service, but part of what you had to do when you were in the military, you had to go back. Okay, every 2 weeks you had to go back for more training, and he did that once or twice, and then he stopped going. Okay, and so he's in essence he's gone AWOL from the French military, and he's kind of feeling the heat. But again, I think there's this kind of prophetic thing. Why doesn't he want to go into the military? Well, the winds of war, World War I, are certainly brewing. And, he's like, I don't want to be in the military maybe, but he chooses to leave and chooses to go to Canada. In 1909, August of 1909, he goes to Canada. So let me, okay, so this is Mont. Sorry, I should have been flipping through these. This is a little video. Okay, this is his house where he was born. Right here that's his full house. Tiny. I went in there, I was like, how could 26 people live in this thing? Okay, so he emigrates to North America. Okay, so in 1909, Peter Maurin takes a ship from Cherbourg, France, and he arrives in New York City, and in New York, he takes a train. He crosses the border at Windsor. We found a document. We know he had $100 in his pocket when he did that, which was a little over 2,000. In today's money, he had more money than most people on the train around him. And then he takes a train to Prince Albert, and he had met someone on the boat from Cherbourg who had a brother-in-law in the region, and they were homesteading. So the Canadian government was basically giving out tracts of land for people to farm, or giving out very cheap tracts of land. And so, yeah, so now he's going from scholar and he's going back to the land. He's becoming a worker again, and he tries this for 2 years. His business partner, is killed in a hunting accident. That's all we know. He's killed in a hunting accident. It becomes too difficult, and he's like, all right, I got to get out of here. So he begins this odyssey. We're in 1911, and for 4 years. 4 or 5 years, he is basically an itinerant worker. He's a hobo. He's jumping trains. He's digging ditches for railways. He's working in mines. He's just a manual labor, just doing manual labor. He hops the border from Ottawa, Canada, the upstate New York border. He enters into the United States in around 1911. And again, he goes up and down the East Coast. I think he goes down as far as Baltimore, and he's slowly he's in Pennsylvania. He gets arrested by accident. He stopped to ask a woman for water, knocked on the door, and she had trouble opening the door, so he tried to help her, and he pushed the door in, and she thought that he was attacking her, and he spent a couple days in jail, but the townspeople became so distressed because he was so nice in jail that they were demanding that he be let out, and it's a pretty funny story. But so he ends up making his way to Chicago around 1914. He begins work in a hardware store, and so at this point, World War I is again when did World War I start?
For the Americans, not till 1917.
Right, 1940. It's going on in Europe.
1914, yeah.
I think another interesting thing to kind of go back to that prophetic part, Le Sillon and Marc Seigneur, the founder, they are criticized in another encyclical by a different pope because they're saying, look, we don't. Whatever bothered Peter Maurin also bothered the Pope, and they wrote an encyclical kind of chastising them. But it's also an encyclical about democracy, and the Catholic Church is still kind of trying to figure out if democracy is a good or bad thing, it seems like to me, but another conversation. So he ends up in Chicago, and I think it's in Chicago that he really enjoys the most success in his life. Financial success. I think he has a lot of success in his life. But he becomes a French teacher. Officers in the army are like, okay, we're probably gonna go to war here, and I'm gonna need to learn French. So he opens up a school in Chicago, right downtown. He lives in the Gold Coast. He's not living in the nice part of Gold Coast. He's in kind of the boarding house area of Gold Coast. But this picture, circa 1920, is, he's very well dressed in this picture. It's a staged picture. I doubt he actually owned that chair. But yeah, he's looking pretty prosperous there. And so, we don't know what happens. Dorothy Day writes that Peter Maurin told her that for a period in his life, he was not living as a Catholic should live, okay? Dorothy Day, she writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, I probably should have put the sources down, but she writes, to me it sounded like, yeah, it was a young man sowing his oats, kind of, you know, she doesn't say the word sex, I think, but it's pretty obvious, like, what she's talking about. But yeah, so he's pretty much out of the church, or he's not living the life of a Catholic. When this started, we have no idea. We don't know, maybe it was after he left the Christian Brothers, maybe it's when he goes to Canada, maybe it's Chicago, but he's going through this period. He was very private about his life. He did not speak a lot. He did not leave a lot of evidence. He did not write a biography. There are a couple of interviews, but even that, the information is pretty scant on the overarching sketch of his life. We just have a very minimal sketch of his life. And so, but something happens around 1925, and he ends up moving to Woodstock, New York, again as a teacher, a French teacher. But he starts changing his life, and he starts living a life of voluntary poverty. And he stops charging money for his classes. He begins reading, or he moves in to a Catholic boys camp. He's kind of like a caretaker on the campus of a Catholic boys camp in the Catskills in upstate New York. And on the weekends, he's spending his time at the library and reading all sorts of stuff. There's a book list that I think I sent out. Does everyone have this? Did I hand that out? So if you look at some of the titles on here, you know, he's reading, so Jean-Baptiste Chotin, The Soul of the Apostolate. He's reading Chesterton. Chesterton had written a biography on St. Francis of Assisi. A lot of people wonder if he read that while he was in Chicago and decided to have a conversion, or you know, maybe came back to the church. But he is extremely well read, and you know, I think there's a good place in here. Let's see. So we're gonna have to flip back. We're gonna have to flip back here. Okay. On page 16, right at the top, underneath the paragraph, the Dorothy Day quote, "It is unfortunate that Peter, who lived the poverty he admired in St. Francis, has acquired the image of a Bowery bum, whereas in fact, he was a brilliant intellectual and one of the best read men of his times." I'll take issue with that. I don't know that we could actually say that, but he was very well read, there's no doubt about it. Going back onto the other side of this page, page 17, many understood and appreciated Peter's sanctity and genius. Mel Peel quoted Massey Ward, wife of Frank Sheed, the author of one of his biographies. "At first glance, you would probably overlook Peter, yet Peter Maurin was perhaps the greatest inspiration of Catholic America in our generation." So she's talking in the 40s, 1940s, 1950s. Arthur Sheehan recorded several commentaries on Peter by well-known people of his time. Cardinal Cardigan, founder of the, what is that, how do you say that, Jocist movement of young workers, said of him that his thought is the pure spirit of the Gospels. Father Wilford Parsons, Jesuit editor of America magazine, once said that Peter Maurin was the best read man he had ever met. John Moody of Moody Investors described one of his meetings with Peter. Anyone who has met Peter knows he can, on first appearance, make the shivers creep up your spine when he begins to talk. If, when he starts in, you are leaning back in an easy chair, you will find yourself sitting up erect in the chair before he has talked 5 minutes. He can cram more truth into your cranium at a high speed in a single hour than any ordinary person can do in a week. His theme was social justice. He gave me, among other things, a gist of Pope Pius XI's encyclical Quadrigesimo Anno, which up to that time I had not digested at all, but Peter had digested it, and he made its content so clear to me that a short time thereafter I was able to give a brief talk on it to a small group of highbrow Wall Streeters and actually tell them some of the things they didn't know. So this is later, obviously. This is in the 1930s, but Peter. There's just no doubt that Peter had read a lot, and the easy essays that he writes are basically condensing these very, very difficult and hard to digest pieces, like an encyclical, into very simple, easy to read, easy to understand format. And the reason why he wrote the easy essays was that he wanted to appeal to both sides, or to the uneducated and the educated. He wanted an easy access to very difficult ideas, and I think he's very successful in that. Just kind of moving on here. How are we doing on time? Am I boring people?
Okay, probably like 10 more minutes and then we can do
Okay.
questions, yeah.
I think one of the things that not bothers me, but that I think about a lot is the importance of Peter on the movement and how easily he can be discounted. And so I've got one other handout here. This was a speech given at the 100th anniversary of the Dorothy Day Centenary Conference in 1997 at Marquette University by Paul Mango. I don't know much about the author, but I really love what he had to say here. And I gotta find my copy. Underline something, but I think he does a great job of just outlining how important he is to the Catholic working movement, and he goes through it pretty well here. He is the intellectual author of the Catholic working movement and Dorothy Day's primary teacher. So throughout the 6-week period, this class, we're going to learn more about this. But there's no doubt that Dorothy Day, when they met in 1932, she had been in the church for about 4 or 5 years, and she really knew nothing about the Catholic social traditions of the church. And so Peter Maurin is kind of her teacher. Once again, he puts on the role of teacher and mentor, and introduces Dorothy Day to Catholic social teachings, which famously he calls the dynamite of the church. That we need to blow the dynamite of the economic program of the Catholic Church, the social program of the Catholic Church, and so he really indoctrinates her, a word that scares people today. So he really forms her. He begins her formation, is another way of talking about indoctrination. And just right in the middle, I propose there is no getting around the significance of Peter Maurin as the intellectual author of the Catholic Worker by virtue of the program he propounded, which Dorothy Day amplified through the newspaper and other forums for years while Peter was alive, and held up as the movement's agenda and purpose for many, many years after his death. You know, it's, she, up until her death, she was writing about Peter Maurin's program and, you know, the clarity of thought, the houses of hospitality, the Catholic worker farms. But the bulk, you know, to understand that, you got to get into the easy essays. And I'm sure we'll be reading them as we go on throughout this course. Another thing, he articulates, this is point number 2, he articulates a substantial critique of modern society and a vision of what society could be instead. And I think that's, yeah, he's always talking about creating a new society in the shell of the old, or creating a world where it's easier to be good. And so his critique, which you can really find in the readings that he suggests, is very well laid out in the easy essays. Just for time, we'll keep going on here. He puts, this is number 3, he puts a challenge to us to form and inform our intellects through clarification of thought, and to share that thought with all manner of people. Peter Maurin spoke to anyone, and he was often, I think this is why he was kind of minimized in the early years of the movement, because he would just talk and talk and talk. And you know, I think he was older than the people that were in the movement at the time, who were probably, you know, most likely to be in their 20s, or just out of college, or maybe in college, or dropouts of college. And yeah, I think they just kind of saw this funny guy who wouldn't shut up. And so some of his stuff may have been lost in translation as well when he was speaking. But I love this middle one. Peter isn't satisfied. He isn't satisfied to have us simply memorize his easy essays. He wants us to grasp what he is pointing to, and he believes that the exchange of ideas through roundtable clarification of thought is absolutely valuable. Dorothy Day emphasizes over and over that clarification of thought is the first point of the Catholic Worker Program, and the reason for the roundtable discussions, the newspapers, and the constant effort to educate people that both Peter and Dorothy undertook. So the significance of clarity of thought is clear. I think Dorothy Day always pushed that forward, and really never forgot about Peter Maurin. And I really love the last part, his manner of practicing Catholicism. Peter Maurin is without a doubt deeply conversant in his religious tradition and able to speak of its spiritual, social, and political implications in his day. It is on this basis that he was able to apply the Church's social teachings to modern problems. He was also as devout and pious and loyal to the Church as he could be, but he barely ever spoke of obedience and orthodoxy. There's another part in here, but the next paragraph. Peter Maurin matters as a Catholic because he shows us how to be faithful to Christ and to his Church. He does so in the personalist terms, taking his own advice to be what you want the other fellow to be. Without a doubt, he advocates that we know our Catholic heritage, that we know the example of the saints and the teachings of the Holy See, that we see the applicability of the Benedictine motto, labor and pray, work and pray, ore labora, to our own lives and to our mission in the world. We'd have a primarily spiritual outlook and motivation for all that we do, so to speak, if we took to heart the example of St. Francis in practicing poverty. And on his voluntary poverty, this is after the first paragraph, the second paragraph. I'm impressed, this is about Peter Maurin's, the first one. But a deeper lesson impresses me in the remembrance of Peter Maurin, particularly those offered by Dorothy Day. We see that he insisted that the works of mercy or a philosophy of poverty, a philosophy of work, such as he proposed, are rooted in the primacy of the spiritual. More significantly, he lived them at a personal sacrifice. Dorothy Day reports that he never had a second coat, that he often gave away his bed. He never had his own desk, and he always ate what was set before him. He's the one who brought every Tom, Dick, and Harry in from Union Square and the Bowery, and thus prompted the first hospitality. And there's one other final part of his faith. I noticed, this is the third paragraph, I noticed too that this is the heart of Peter Maurin's adherence to the church. These acts of love, a very impressive fidelity that speaks so much truer than the voices in our church that clamor on the one hand for order, orthodoxy, and obedience, and on the other, equality, democracy, and inclusion. So I'll wrap it up here with the last easy essay. Peter Maurin, he dies in 1949. And he died in a converted chicken coop in upstate New York on a farm. And in a way, it was, to me, it was like, yeah, he was born on this peasant farm, and he dies in a converted chicken coop. He had nothing. They had to donate a suit, and the Conway family donated this grave. He's buried with 1, 2, 3, 4 other people. He's just another guy in a grave at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York. Time magazine wrote an obituary. The Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Vaticano, I forget the name of it.
The Romana,
Yeah.
the official.
The official
Yeah.
paper of the Vatican had a front page obituary on him. American Magazine, the Jesuits covered it. So yeah, and I think the author of this text, he calls this the spirit of the mass, the spirit of the masses. This is probably his most religious easy essay. I think for the Eucharistic revival, this is a great one. Does anyone want to read it? You want to read it, Gary?
Sure. I just read it a little bit ago. The central act of devotional life in the Catholic Church is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The sacrifice of the Mass is the unbloody repetition of the sacrifice of the cross. On the cross of Calvary, Christ gave his life to redeem the world. The life of Christ is a life of sacrifice. The life of a Christian must be a life of sacrifice. We cannot imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary by trying to get all we can. We can only imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary by trying to give all we can. Yeah, this helped me decide to come here instead of take a nap this afternoon.
I mean, there's so much more to talk about. There's the, in addition, I feel like I didn't touch enough on the easy essays, but just his conversion, his program, his meeting of Dorothy Day, the anarchism, there's so much that I don't know. There's 3 biographies.
James,
Yeah.
could you, I know we want to save some of the Catholic workers stuff for later, but could you explain how Peter Maurin got from the Boyce Farm in upstate New York to Dorothy Day? How he got to...
Yeah, so...
And maybe that quote about that she had in that book that you're reading about how she felt meeting him, what it was like meeting Peter Maurin.
Yeah, I think this is, let's see here. Okay, so this is on page 16, the quote that Renee is talking about. I probably should have ended on this. But yeah, so he's in Woodstock, New York. That's where he lands first in 1925, coming back to Chicago. He goes to he's doing his studies and visiting New York, and he comes up with this program, and he starts shopping it around, right? He's going to different magazines. Pretty sure he went to America. The Jesuits, you know, they just probably thumb their nose at it. They have no prophetic vision whatsoever. Commonweal, the editor of Commonweal, George Schuster, he recommended Dorothy Day. But there's two different accounts. One account is that he gave him the address and Peter Maurin went there. The other account is that Peter Maurin got the name from George Schuster, and then he met a red-headed Irish communist around Union Square, and when he was speaking to her, when Peter spoke to this red-headed Irish communist, he said, "Oh, you should meet Dorothy Day," and he brought her. He knew where she lived. Dorothy Day had just come back from the Hunger March, covering the Hunger March for America magazine, and when she had prayed because she had witnessed this terrible violence against people who were hungry, and she was like, why are the communists helping the poor? Where's the Catholic Church? And she just didn't, she was an activist herself, and we'll find all this out, but she was just kind of praying for something, and she comes back, and here's this guy, Peter Maurin, and you know, she talks of meeting him and the effect that he had. He made one feel the magnificent. Oh wait, is this the? Wait, I'm reading the wrong one. Are you talking about the quote? I do not know. I do know this. Yeah. Okay. So he made one feel the magnificence of our work, our daily lives, the material of God's universe, and what we did with it, how we used it. He built up a new apostolate. He reached the poorest and the most destitute by living always among them, sharing their poverty and sharing what he had with them. I do know this, that when people came into contact with Peter, they changed, they awakened, they begin to see. Things become as new. They look at life in the light of the Gospels. They admit the truth he possesses and lives by. And though they themselves fail to go the whole way, their faces are turned at least toward the light. So, yeah, I failed, without a doubt. Any questions, comments, controversies?
What drew you? Oh, this is
Go ahead, Suzanne.
I want to know what drew you specifically in your research on Peter, and what it is that in his journey has actually allowed you yourself and the work you've done as Catholic worker, but not just in the faith but scholarly, because you've done so much research.
Well, I just think that there's big gaps in his. Well, I was very just drawn to him to begin with. Once I really dove into these essays, and I began to see that you really, in order to understand the Catholic worker movement, and I think Dorothy Day, you really needed to understand Peter Maurin, and there were just large gaps in his biography. I don't think I've, there's this other guy, Mathieu Langlois. We found pieces that fill in some of his biography. Like, no one knew who we met on that boat from France to North America. We were able to find the guy that he met. We know where he stayed probably when he first arrived in Prince Albert. So it's like little just details. We know that before he reached out to Dorothy Day, he reached out to this guy, Miles Conley, who was, he wrote a book called Mr. Blue. He was a pretty famous Hollywood producer, screenwriter by 1932, but Peter Maurin wrote him in 1932 before he wrote Dorothy Day, hoping that he would want to start a newspaper with him. Miles Conley's interesting of himself. He was editor of Columbia magazine from 1924 to 1928, and he had Jacques Maritain, Hilaire Belloc writing for Columbia. These are people that Peter Maurin quoted all the time in his easy essays, and so we just found interesting tidbits. But yeah, I just think he's a fascinating guy, and I think to understand the Catholic worker, you need to understand Peter Maurin. That's basically it.
Can I ask one more question about the French movement? In your research, because I haven't read the articles yet, but in your research, did you see, because you talked about the movement and how it was related to his own diaspora and to the United States, but how did, what other phase and faith learning did influenced into what Dorothy and Peter were doing out of the French movement? I had heard like French personalism, or it was individualism.
Yeah, and that's
But,
certainly, yeah, so the Catholic worker movement is, even though it's an American lay movement, it's very much influenced by French Catholic philosophy, in particular Jacques Maritain and Mounier and personalism. And like personalism is, you know, at its root, it's basically that we are personally responsible for our brother and sister. Like that's like the most basic definition. But Peter Maurin is in many ways the ultimate personalist, because he really just spoke to a lot of people, and he was always trying to get his program out, but in ways that he wasn't trying to convert the whole world. He talks, his ideas were not meant just for Catholics. This is on page 15. His friends were Jews, Protestants, agnostics, as well as Catholics, and he found common ground with all in what he termed the Thomistic doctrine of the common good. You know, so his what he saw was like, look, Catholicism has the dynamite of the Catholic Church, Catholic social teaching, is something that people can find common ground on all levels. And I think a good example today, contemporary, would be like Laudato Si. Like, that is a document that is steeped in Catholic tradition, but is read by all sorts of believers, non-believers. And I think Peter Maurin recognized that Catholic social teaching in general is something that can reach across, you know, in a political term, the aisle. But so I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
that was amazing. Thanks.
One thing, I know Cyrus had a question, but if we want to be very gentle and pass these around, Stephanie might remember, or Daniel, how these easy essays came to the house, but these are easy essays written in Peter Maurin's own handwriting. So maybe this is kind of the most sorry, intact. We'll pass, maybe you want to pass it around, Mike, yeah.
Can you hold it up?
We'll pass it around.
Oh, okay.
There are also 3 biographies out there. One is written by Arthur Sheehan in 1959. There was only one printing. It didn't make it past it. That's a hard one to find, but it's excellent. It's free online. And then there's another biography by Francis Sisius, who I think is a Loyola grad. He took Dorothy Day's, this one's called Peter Maurin, Apostle to the World. It says by Dorothy Day and Francis Sisius. So Francis Sisius kind of took Dorothy Day's manuscript and filled it in. So this is out there. I think this is the best, most available one. It was written in 1986 by Mark Ellis, who's Jewish and is a pretty famous Jewish theologian, Jewish liberation theology, theologian. But he lived at the Catholic Worker. He also has another book, My Year at the Catholic Worker. But this is Peter Maurin, prophet in the 20th century. This is out there. You can get this pretty much on anywhere online. It gives a good one. And there's also a lot of there's this latest book, The Forgotten Radical, Peter Maurin, which there's another thing we're trying to do is like make sure he's not forgotten here today. This came out in 2020, Fordham University Press. It's edited by Lincoln Rice, and it's the complete and annotated edition of his easy essays. This is to me like the gold standard of getting to know the easy essays. There's a lot of books out there you can get, and they're just the easy essays with no explanations. But they were written in the 30s and 40s, and so a lot of the stuff that he is talking about, he'll drop names or things that may have been pretty well known at the time, but are just kind of lost on us, in 2023. Lincoln Rice does a great job of just doing all the research, because I remember reading easy essays and then kind of going online when I got lost, and then like you're just down a rabbit hole forever. So he brings it all in one place. He's also going to be speaking here, at Canterbury House on March 16th. We're going to be doing his Irish easy essays, and Lincoln Rice is going to be here to talk about all the Irish easy essays. But this is like $40. I've seen them online used for like 30 something. I've lent this out twice and it's come back. So I don't know if someone wants to borrow it, but I may have to get some collateral. Are there any questions? Cyrus, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the. I really appreciated the French context for his early life. I was thinking about the American context in which he arrived and then lived here. And so it's a little bit of an observation, but then a question. So it seems like, you look at the history of the progressive movement at that time. He shows up kind of right at the heart of the progressive movement. So this is workers' rights, women's rights, income tax, progressive income tax, all these things. So that was primarily, it was almost entirely based in the Republican Party and Protestant. And in fact, Catholics for a whole bunch of reasons, in the Democratic Party at that time, still pretty reactionary. By the time you get to 32, the election of Roosevelt, that starts to change, and then by the time Kennedy's elected in 60, of course, that kind of completes the Catholic, or really, really nearly completes the Catholic transition to a more progressive Democratic Party. So I'm curious, like, I've always been interested in, like, how did this happen, right? Like, how did it happen? Both the party switch, but more narrowly for our purposes here, like the realignment of Catholic voters to be more in line with issues of unionization, inclusion, a fairer economy. And I wondered, like, so the question for you is, like, is there anything in the record that shows whether he was a catalyst for this, in normalizing some of this? Was it already happening and he was a part of the movement? You mentioned that he worked with Protestants, or he had Protestant friends. Was that maybe a way he was a bridge? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I would say Peter Maurin was on a totally different level. He was looking, like, when he saw the Quadragesimo Anno come out in 1931 or probably 1931. It's 40 years after the encyclical, Rerum Novarum. So another encyclical comes out celebrating the what is it called? Rerum Novarum. 40 years later, it's called, and this was a huge inspiration in the early movement and to Peter. This is where he's really kind of talking about cooperatives and things of that nature. I don't think Peter or Dorothy, the politics were not, it didn't interest them. He speaks of Republicans and Democrats, but what he's proposing is on a
So just forget that I even mentioned those parties.
Yeah.
The question is, it would seem odd to me for it to be a complete and utter coincidence that millions of Catholics during that exact 3-decade period shifted from being reactionaries to being progressives, and that at that same time you had, as to your point, such influential movement leaders. Do you think it's a complete utter coincidence, or do you think there's some causal?
Well, I think kind of, I'm thinking actually of the talk that Mike was listening to that John McGreevy gave a couple weeks ago when he was talking about Catholicism and democracy. And he said Al Smith in like the
1928 election,
he said, someone asked him what he thought about an encyclical, and he goes, what's an encyclical? Right, and so I think Dorothy and Peter are very influential, right? So like, they're five years into the publishing of their paper in May 1938. Their subscription numbers are like, they're almost at 200,000. They're 10,000 subscribers short of 200,000. So I think they were very influential in the sort of like Catholic media sphere, to call it that, in the Catholic political sphere. And I think, while they're not commenting on, I've never seen in an old paper them commenting on an election or on a platform. Their specific goal is to popularize encyclicals, right?
Yeah.
So they're trying to make a world where it's like, no, actually, like, encyclicals are not getting lost in seminaries or, in this sort of clerical sphere, that they're really bringing these messages out into the lay world. Where, right, you have this sort of moment in U.S. history as well, where Catholics are starting to kind of inch their way into the halls of power of public life, and they're kind of forming Catholics around the same time that movement is happening.
Okay, yeah.
Does that?
Yeah,
kind of
because
answer
then
what you're saying,
then
James?
actual laws got passed to allow people to unionize, like the NLRA, right? So that's why I do think it's huge. They might have thought it was beneath them, but I do think it's fascinating for us historically to see how actual unions could then form on a national level, like the ones that are still here today.
And I wouldn't think it's like beneath them or like not something that they cared about. It's more just like personalism can coexist in any, like the question of like, right, government's very important to Catholic social teaching, but I think Peter Maurin always comes down to like, that's great if you live in a society where this is pre-FDR and there's no social net, or post-FDR and there is a social safety net, but like ultimately, like for the human being as an individual person who's always making the choice between giving all you can and getting all you can, how are you sort of individually living that choice each day? So yeah, it's like, it's not that it's.
And also, I don't think he was, like, he wasn't even in favor of wages for labor. Like he thought labor should be a gift, and he was much more about a gift economy and cooperatives, and he really, in a lot of ways, they diverge, the movement and Peter Maurin. He's really disappointed with the first issue of the Catholic Worker newspaper. He like disappeared, and he was so upset when he saw the copy, because he's like, this is not. And years later, Dorothy Day looks back on it in Fishes and Loaves, or Loaves and Fishes, the book. I think it was I forget when it came out, but it was after The Long Loneliness. But she's like, yeah, I looked at the first thing, and it's all about strikes and this and that. And and Peter's like, fire the bosses, like get rid of it all. And so he was often accused of being just too utopian and too much
pie in the sky. Like, it's just impossible what he's proposing. But for Peter, yeah, this was like, this is heaven on earth. Like, this is what we have to work towards. So yeah, it's interesting. Like, the more I read Peter Maurin, and the less I care about the politics around me. I really can't stomach it. So, but yeah. Anyway.
Well, we can keep eating cookies and drinking coffee and discussing. I'm gonna turn off the official end of the lecture. Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
Yeah.